thanks again for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. And today I want to talk to you about global labor history in the 17th century. And what I and a colleague of mine, Evelyn Jennings, consider to be an overlooked, neglected part of labor history. And that part of labor history is not how markets organize labor, but how the state does, for the purpose of building not only the power of the empire, but the profitability of the market itself. Okay, so that's the big idea. So let me set the stage, the time period, the situation, because most of this lecture will be about a specific event in this wider history. Okay, so the time is 1655. The place is the Republic of England, the short-lived Republic of England. It's a time of revolution in England. The king had been executed. A republic had replaced the monarchy. And the power of the English military had never been as potent. As one Englishman said at this time, never had England been poised for world conquest to the level they had in 1655. So the leader of the revolution, Oliver Cromwell, like many revolutionaries, wants to export the revolution. He wants to move it around the world because he believes that as a Protestant, exporting the English Revolution will save souls, but it will also build the power of the English as an empire in the Atlantic. So, the revolutionaries turned their mind to conquest. And they turned their mind to the Spanish Caribbean. And they justify their plans for conquest drawing on the black legend of Spanish atrocities, massacres of Native Americans, the indigenous people of the Americas. And the rhetoric, the talk, the discourse is, we will avenge the atrocities of the Spanish and free the Native Americans of the Caribbean from slavery and from the false religion of Catholicism. But to do that, we need to conquer them. The big question was, who's going to do the conquering? Who is going to do the work of imperial conquest? Who is going to do the fighting? So with that background, I take you to the English city of Portsmouth, which is one of the bases for the English Navy. So fleets, armadas leave from Portsmouth historically. They do to this day. So Portsmouth is a big naval base. And at Portsmouth, in December of 1655, are 4,000 memento. Are 4,000 shivering men clothed in rags who have been brought by force to Portsmouth, and they're lined up on the docks. They have no idea, or no certain idea, of why they're there. They are all poor. They are all without property. They are the working poor of Great Britain. Now they have suspicions of why they're there. They have a clue. because they know the state, the government, has been rounding up poor people and making them do work against their will for about 20 years. So one of the things they suspect is that they've been brought there either out of prisons, just taken up out of their, off the streets of England for the crime of being poor. Some are petty thieves. Some are soldiers who've been conscripted or forced to serve in Ireland. Whatever brought them there, or wherever they came from, they understood at that point that they had no power and they were going to be forced to do something against their will, some kind of labor. One idea was they were going to be sold to another empire as soldiers. This was a way for the English to make money, but also for the English to kick poor people out of the country, because they were perceived as dangerous criminals, rebels, and so forth. So get the unwanted people out of the country by sending them to serve in foreign armies. Another idea was that they were being conscripted, forced into the English military. Conscription for the military. That was another idea. The third idea, and this is what disturbed them the most, although the first two choices weren't, well, not choices, the first two conditions weren't great. The third idea was that they would be shipped to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations next to enslaved Africans. This was a condition called indentured servitude. The government had been forcing poor people from Britain and Ireland into indentured servitude in the colonies since the 1620s. So that's the scene. 4,000 men, rags, shivering. They don't know where they're going, but they know they're going somewhere against their will. And in this tense situation, a mutiny breaks out. On the docks, a cannon is fired, signaling the men to board the ship. They refuse. They scatter throughout the city. They're brought together again, and literally, other soldiers have to force them onto the ship at gunpoint. Once they're on the ship, within sight of the coast of England, they stage another rebellion. And the language that they're using to justify the opposition is they're fearful they're going to be sold as slaves. Now they know they're not going to be enslaved for life like Africans, but they fear that indentured servitude, making them work against their will, is a form of slavery. And what's more, as an indentured servant, you're not only forced to work against your will, you are also considered the property of your master. So you enter a labor condition without your consent, and you become the property of your master, but only for a term, a series of years, maybe 4 to 7 years. So the fear of enslavement sparks this mutiny. Even before the soldiers' mutiny, however, there's another mutiny before this force leaves the coast of England, and this mutiny, this rebellion, is by sailors. The sailors who are on the ships to transport the soldiers. Very few of them have entered the Navy freely. They have been called, the term is impressed. Impressment. It's like conscription. It's forcing you to fight against your will in the Navy. Okay, so we have 4,000 soldiers, 3,000 sailors. None of them are entering the service voluntarily. The sailors themselves stage a mutiny. They want better pay. They want also an end to the system of impressment itself. They want to abolish the system by which the government can force them to serve against their will in the Navy.
We're getting on board, like on the ships. And was that before or after the Pilgrims' arrival to America?
After.
And you also mentioned that sometimes England sold British people, right, to other countries.
Yeah.
And which country bought most of these, let's call, slaves?
Sure. The French.
So England sold
And the
people?
Spanish. Yes.
Was it profitable?
For the crown, for the court, yes, to a degree.
And were these people seen as objects, as properties, right? Were they paid or nearly treated as slaves, as African? I mean, you said that it was only for some period of time,
Yeah.
right? But
Right.
were they paid or anything, or
Right.
only?
Esclavos is a word that's a problem here for our understanding. The soldiers who are sold to a foreign power, that's like a contract between the governments. The soldiers who are sold, they do get paid. Okay. They don't get paid much. They're supposed to be paid. Sometimes they actually don't get paid. So that's how esclavos becomes part of that idea. Now, the indentured servants, they are considered property for the time they're in their indenture or their contract. But see, that's another problem word. Contract. When the government takes you out of your home or off the street because you're poor and sends you to the colonies to work on a sugar plantation, they have imposed a contract on you. In modern economic thinking or modern legal thinking, a contract is an agreement between equal parties who enter it freely. So I don't like the term contract or indenture here. In fact, many of those forced into indentured servitude. Now, the soldier, or those who had been forced onto the ships, they didn't know where they were going. But once they're out of sight of England, they find out, their officers tell them that they're headed towards the Caribbean, and that they're on a mission to destroy the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. The main object of attack is going to be here in Hispaniola, but before I get to that, I have to mention a couple other things. So the attack is going to be on Hispaniola. When the Armada comes into port in Barbados, they realize two things. One, they don't have enough soldiers. And two, the merchant who had had a contract to supply weapons, guns, cheated them. Supposed to have 4,000 weapons, they only have about 1,000. So a couple things happen. First is, how do the officers get money to buy more weapons for the soldiers to use? And here's where the state comes in another way. Here's how the government comes in another way. The English revolutionary government had passed a new set of laws for the empire. They were called the Navigation Acts. And what they called for was English colonies could only trade with English merchants. So the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, out. The thinking is, colonies should enrich the empire. They should enrich the mother country. If we're trading with other empires, that capital's flowing out and not into our coffers. So when the Armada comes to Barbados, they see Dutch slave ships anchored in the harbor. And they haven't sold the human beings below deck. So what the commanders of the expedition do, under the Navigation Act, is they confiscate the ship, they confiscate the slaves, and they sell the ship and the slaves to raise money to buy arms. So one form of unfreedom, or one form of forced labor, requires profits from another form of forced labor to do the business of imperial conquest. I think that's a fascinating conjunction. Now, so they're getting the weapons. They need more soldiers. How are they going to get more soldiers in the Caribbean? Well, there are lots of men in the Caribbean who would rather be fighting than doing what they're doing. What ends up happening is that the English commanders issue a proclamation that all indentured servants who want to join the expedition can come and be part of this great imperial invasion. Now here's what's fascinating. The poor men in England have been forced into the military. They understand their condition as a form of bondage, of slavery. The indentured servants in Barbados, who have been forced there by the state to work on plantations, they see the expedition, they see the military as liberation from what they consider slavery. So we have this fascinating mix of military labor being forced and then also providing an avenue for liberation from worse types of plantation labor. Okay.
Yes, so the Armada arrived in this area, in the Caribbean, en los Caribes. Perdón, porque inglés y español al mismo tiempo, entonces se dan cuenta que no tienen bastantes soldados, bastantes militares. Los mercaderos también se realizan que no tienen bastante dinero para comprar o vender las armas que necesitaban, y entonces ¿cómo se puede obtener, ¿no? este dinero? ¿Cómo se puede obtener, cómo se pueden comprar más armas, ¿no? El gobierno inglés, la República Inglesa, establece una ley que se llama Navigation Act, que es un permiso, decimos así, a través del cual se puede justificar, decimos, una relación, un enlace entre esos tipos de mercaderos sin ley, outside the law, decimos, ¿no? Y lo que querían colonizar el Caribe. Además, los comandantes ingleses confiscaron las naves caribeñas y
certain way, una cierta manera de construir, se formó, ¿cómo se puede decir? Una forma de no libertad, ¿no? De falta de libertad absoluta, pero al mismo tiempo se justificaba un business, ¿cómo se puede decir? Un comercio, sí, que no tenía un sentido desde el punto de vista de la ley, ¿no? Y eso es la cosa que más golpea, ¿no? Como se, debajo de una ley que viene instituida, se puede justificar algo que está completamente fuera de la ley, ¿no?
So now, 7,000 soldiers, 4,000 sailors, 28 ships. The expedition sails from Barbados here to attack Hispaniola. That attack fails miserably. And it's a shock because the English revolutionary military had won every battle it had fought since 1645. And the Spanish humiliate the English on Hispaniola. 1,000 English troops die. And it's fascinating, the Spanish forces that defeat the English are largely made up of African slaves who've been promised their freedom in return for fighting. So this tension or this interplay between freedom and slavery and military labor and empire building, I think, is just moving all over the place. We really need to pay attention to these dynamics because they're so fluid. Okay, well, the commanders of the expedition know if they return to England with the poor, ragged mass of men, they'll probably be executed by Cromwell. Because a lot of English writers at this time, and they're correct, they're saying one of the purposes of this invasion is to clean England out of the rabble, of the poor, because they commit crimes, because they raise rebellions, because they raise taxes to pay for their poverty, to feed them, to house orphans that they leave behind. Plus, remember, these revolutionaries are Puritans, fanatics, Protestant fanatics. And they believe the poor are poor because they're evil. Their souls are corrupt. So this is an economic, political, and spiritual project to get the, quote, rabble out of England, to turn them into what in English, cannon fodder. Let them die in the Caribbean. Well, Hispaniola fails, so they turn their attention next to Jamaica. And this was one of the problems with the Spanish Empire that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was so vast. It wasn't an Atlantic empire. It was a global empire. It had lots of territory and sea space to defend, and a limited supply of military labor to do so. Jamaica, very small amount of soldiers to guard it. And so when the English land on Jamaica, it's an easy battle for them to conquer it from the Spanish. Now, and I'm not going to talk about this today, while the English can defeat the Spanish easily, they will still be fighting for the next 150 years African slaves who escaped to the mountains when the invasion happened and created their own free communities called Maroon communities. So in some ways, the English conquest of Jamaica is easy against the Spanish, but against the resistance of enslaved people, I don't think you can ever call it a success.
So, sì, stavamo hablando appunto por supuesto de la conquista de la Jamaica, que fue sencilla, fue fácil por lo que concierne la relación con España, pero desde el punto de vista de la población que encontraron en la isla fue algo muy duro, porque los poblantes, la población de Jamaica fue muy fuerte, su contraste contra los ingleses fue muy fuerte, sí. Los ingleses encontraron fuerte la posición, ¿no? Dos lados, doble aspecto, ¿no? Más fácil desde el punto de vista político, por lo que concierne la política exterior, por lo que concierne España, pero un fuerte contraste por lo que concierne el interior de la Jamaica.
Once on Jamaica, the commanders realized very quickly that their soldiers, well, they realized quickly that their force, their army, is dying. Diseases in the Caribbean that the English succumb to easily are killing off 6,000 out of 7,000 soldiers. There's no food. There's not enough provisions. There are accounts, I've seen them in the archives, of new English officers arriving on Jamaica, and they see soldiers naked. They have no uniforms anymore. And they're crying out, bread, for the sake of God, bread. And dogs are literally eating soldiers who have died of starvation in the streets. Okay, so that's a grim situation. For the survivors, the soldiers who survive, it's almost like a long death sentence. Because the officers who have been given land in Jamaica for pay, right? So the officers, their payment is Jamaican land. The officers want the land to be sugar plantation industry. But they don't have access to African slave labor, so they force their soldiers to begin clearing land, to plant food, and begin the process of turning Jamaica into a sugar plantation. Now remember, when they were in England, ready on the dock, shivering, didn't know what was happening. They feared that they might be sent to the Caribbean as indentured servants, a condition they thought of as slavery. That's exactly what happened to them. So they mutiny, they rebel again.
Lo que pasa, entonces, cuando llegan a Jamaica, lo que pasa es que encuentran, como hemos dicho, una situación muy peligrosa, muy difícil. Entonces no solamente un contraste desde el punto de vista de una oposición, pero también situaciones muy difíciles como enfermedades, muchos soldados mueren, decenas y decenas, miles y miles de soldados no tienen que comer y quieren pan, simplemente comer, como decía ahora el profesor, ¿no? Cried out bread. Él ha hecho un cuadro también de los perros, ¿no? que curaban también, ¿no? los soldados, las heridas de los soldados. Entonces una situación muy mala, muy triste. Los soldados que sobrevivieron a esta situación fueron también enrollados, decimos así, empleados en la cultivación de las tierras y sobre todo en las plantaciones de azúcar. Esos soldados al final, como había dicho al principio de esta charla, que tenían un sueldo, aunque mínimo, se convierten en esclavos y más o menos como esclavos. Y entonces, sí, eso es el pasaje, ¿no? Que el profesor ha más veces subrayado, ¿no? Una situación que al principio al comienzo parece algo legal, que en realidad se convierte en algo que de legal no tiene nada, porque son utilizados igualmente como esclavos, ¿no? Como esclavos en esas plantaciones de azúcar.
Some of the officers in Jamaica give up. They don't want to face rebellions, they don't want to die of disease, and they go home. Others stay, and the ones who stay become the founders of what will become the richest class of planters in the British Empire. So for example, Colonel Francis Price, Colonel Samuel Long, Colonel Thomas Lynch, the Long family, the Lynch family, and the Price family. They will become dynasties in Jamaica. They are like the sugar barons, the sugar kings. And their influence continues to this day. So Francis Price, for example, founds a plantation he calls Worthy Park. It becomes very successful. Francis Price's grandson and great-grandson will become the leaders of the Jamaican Assembly. Others will go back to England and become members of Parliament. And when they become members of Parliament, they become the chief supporters of the Caribbean sugar planters. So that heritage, that legacy of the invasion has long-term consequences, not just for Jamaica, but for the British Empire. And considering sugar's importance in the early global economy, the invasion will leave its imprint on the way that the global economy will flourish for the next 2 centuries.
Bueno, entonces unos de esos soldados, esos militares se huyeron, ¿no? Regresaron a Inglaterra o se huyeron en otros lugares. Otros se quedaron y se volvieron emprendedores. Entonces, otra vez, dos caras que se oponen, ¿no? Dos lados de la medalla muy diferentes, ¿no? Lo que huyen y lo que se quedan y que tienen, que encuentran un profito, ¿no? Desde esta situación. Un ejemplo muy importante de lo que muchos que han nombrado ahora el profesor es esta Worthy Park Estate, es propiedad fundada por el capitán Francis Price, que era un oficial que llegó a Jamaica con este proyecto, ¿no? Con este Western Design, y su actividad fue el principio de una actividad que toda su descendencia desarrolló a lo largo de los siglos siguientes. Y como he dicho ahora, la familia Price siguió siendo una presencia y una fuerza muy importante, también como tenedores de esclavos, y también como comerciante de esclavos. Entonces, sí, este es otro aspecto muy interesante de cómo este aspecto, ¿no? de la legalidad, de la explotación, decimos, de esos militares, de esos soldados, se convierte en algo muy que tiene muchas facetas, ¿no? Por lo que concierne el imperio afuera de Inglaterra, en Inglaterra misma, porque esas familias también regresan a Inglaterra y son, por ejemplo, representantes del Parlamento, ¿no? Entonces, sí, hay ese interesantísimo doble aspecto, ¿no? Muy negativo y muy positivo al mismo tiempo, ¿no?
You can still drink the legacy of the Western design because Worthy Park is still producing sugar and rum today, and this is the brand. I think that is just absolutely fascinating. Literally, we can consume the product of this history we're talking about. Not just generically, sugar, but I mean like literally a brand of rum. Okay. Now, when I was sitting where you were, when I was a student, some of you are students, not all, of course, there's some faculty members here. When I was a student, some of my professors told me, why are you so interested in this armada? You know, you're very worked up about it. They said, this is just the way it was in the 17th century. This is just how militaries organized. Now, whenever an historian says, it's just the way it was, that's when I stop listening. Because nothing's just the way it was. It's all history. It's all being created by human decisions, right? So nothing's just the way it was. Everything's made and created. And that gives us hope because it can be unmade if we don't like it. But more on that later. So, to me, I didn't listen to that advice, and I wanted to study not just the Western design, but the whole idea of governments forcing people into different kinds of work, whether it would be in the military or on the plantation. Because no empire could have flourished, no plantation could have profited, no commerce could have moved around the world without the mobilization, without the calling into action of labor And what we've missed as historians, I think, is the importance of the government, not the market, so to speak, but the government's forceful, active, and historically necessary part in that mobilization. Okay, so here is why it's important. The soldiers who were forced to leave England and fight in the Caribbean. Military conscription. That is something new in British history at that point. The only way you could be forced to fight as a soldier, historically, was if there was a rebellion or a foreign invasion, such as the Spanish Armada in 1588. What's new here, one is like direct and the other is conceptual. The direct novelty is the state is doing this for the first time. And it's not just doing it for the first time, it's doing it on a huge scale. But I think historically, we can take a step back and think, what does this mean? What does this forcing men into military labor, what does it mean in terms of the nature of state power at this time? What the state views as its rightful authority. And here's what's new. Conscription, forcing people to fight, is the state making a new sovereign claim. It's inventing a new sovereign power for itself to claim dominion over the military labor of its subjects. But it's not just labor, because you can't divide a body from work. Bodies do work. So what's invented here is a sovereign power to claim dominion over the bodies and military labor of the poor. This is an innovation in sovereign state power in the early modern period that is of immense historical significance. Because without the sovereign power to force people to fight, the British Empire never would have been made.
Con esas líneas que yo creo que están muy claras, es un resumen muy bueno, ¿no? De lo que ha hasta ahora dicho el profesor, ¿no? Donde se dice que esta movilización del Estado británico y la fuerza militar y la fuerza laboral en las plantaciones del Caribe, se puede describir o se puede desarrollar observando tres diferentes aspectos, ¿no? Una movilización de tipo, decimos, coercitiva, ¿no? Una movilización militar por parte de este Western Design, que fue algo original, algo novedoso, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista político. Y sí, tanto por su forma, como dice aquí, como por su fin, ¿no? Y este trabajo forzoso de lo que estamos hablando hoy ayudó también a producir otros trabajos forzosos, y eso también es un asunto muy importante. Y ha sido directamente conectada con la expansión comercial, ¿no? de la Inglaterra. Y esto ha asegurado el abastecimiento de trabajo de esclavos dell'imperio inglese. No? L'ultimo punto, il punto C, nos habla del hecho que los mercaderos caribeños y lo que se enteraba en las plantaciones tuvieron también un conflicto, ¿no? Fue un conflicto de interés. Entonces se organizó algo que había el intento de asegurar a las dos partes fuerza laboral, pero en una situación de servidumbre, ¿no? De condiciones de servidumbre y de esclavitud absoluta, ¿no? Y eso es un poco el resumen, ¿no? de este concepto de movilización por parte del Estado británico.
One very important point. When we talk about military labor being forced to do the work of fighting to expand the empire, it's not contained to the world of politics. This military labor is necessary to form a capitalist economy in the early modern period based on other forms of unfree labor. So for example, the Navigation Acts need to be enforced. Who's going to enforce the Navigation Acts? Who's going to keep foreign powers from selling slaves to planters in Barbados and Jamaica? It's sailors who have been forced into service in the Royal Navy. Who is going to do the labor to guard the English slave ships that begin to come to Jamaica and Barbados and Virginia later, after the English enter the slave trade? So think about it this way also. The military labor that is forced to fight in Jamaica conquers a colony that over the next 150 years, this statistic is mind-blowing. 1 million enslaved Africans will be brought to Jamaica, which becomes the richest colony in the British Empire. The ratio of slaves to whites in Jamaica is 9 slaves for every 1 white person. Jamaica is profitable, but for its history as a slave colony, it's radically unstable. Every 2 or 3 years, there's a major slave rebellion. Who's going to put down the slave rebellions? Right? So one form of forced labor breeds an entire system of forced labor. One is organized by the state, but the state's organization of this forced labor system enters what we would call the global economic market. And without that state intervention, the profitability of the slave plantation complex in the Atlantic wouldn't have been possible. Are there any questions right now? Okay, I'll keep going. All right. Okay, so the problem of forced labor, the whole spectrum, the whole array of forced labor in the Atlantic world, from soldiers who are forced to fight, sailors, indentured servants, and African slaves. my co-author, Evelyn Jennings, who's a professor at St. Lawrence University, we thought a book, it was time for a book to address this spectrum of unfree labor, and particularly how states, governments, imperial states were vital to its mobilization. That the state itself needed to be featured as a central agent in the deployment of unfree labor and organizer. And what we were trying to do was undermine centuries of teaching that in the colonial era, markets, the alleged natural working of supply and demand, would calibrate the supply of labor and its deployment around empires and around different market sites of production. So featuring the state became very important to us. And so here was our method. Do you want to?
Yes, yes, la metodología, ¿no? Como dice el profesor, la escuela de pensamiento, ¿no? School of Thoughts, lo que se puede resumir de esos estudios es que esta idea, ¿no? Quiere comparar lo que fueron los regímenes que se enteraron de la fuerza laboral de las colonias en el imperio atlántico, entonces en el Caribe, las que fueron las diferentes formas de labor forzoso, ¿no? En un aspecto, podemos decir, de amplio, ¿no? Más largo de trabajo, unfree, entonces como esclavos, ¿no? Y como también la economía del capitalismo, ¿no? La política capitalística ha sido algo que ha dado lugar o ha tenido, decimos, como objetivo las resources del Estado, ¿no? Del Estado. Entonces, ¿cómo esas economías, ¿no? han desarrollado esto? El profesor dice por un trabajo de tipo militar, entonces, como hemos dicho muchas veces, traído adelante por los soldados que han conquistado el mercado a su manera y han defendido las colonias también y han podido construir un imperio y estructuras, infraestructuras, porque sí, no hemos hablado exactamente de eso, pero se supone que el imperio también ha construido muchas estructuras y por eso también fueron utilizados los esclavos o los soldados de manera más larga, ¿no? Entonces, sí, se puede decir que, ha dicho antes que al final la esclavitud en esta área del mundo, en el área del Atlántico, se ha convertido en una institución que fue ineficaz, ineficiente y bastante paternalista, ¿no? Me parece también habías utilizado este término, ¿no? Antes del paternalismo, ¿no? No, paternalismo no habéis entendido. Ok, eso es.
Okay, so one of the most important points of the book was to counter an old school of thought that still has power, but is rapidly fading. And that school of thought is, and I think it goes back to a misreading of Karl Marx, is that the age of capital depends on the end of economies that are based on bound or unfree or imposed labor, and the flourishing, the beginning of economies where wage labor becomes the standard. And the idea was you need the freedom of wage labor, the mobility of wage laborers to move to different parts of the market where their labor is in demand. And bound labor didn't have that mobility. And the thinking was bound or unfree or slave labor wasn't profitable. It was inefficient. And I think some of the new work that's coming out by global labor historians, and they have a collective name. It's called the New History of Capitalism. What these historians are showing is what Eric Williams talked about in the 1940s and was never taken seriously enough by enough historians, and that is capitalism under the slave regime of the early modern period is one of the most innovative and profit-producing eras of economic history, and that the age of capital under slavery is going to lay the capital foundation for industrial capitalism. What Evelyn and I wanted to do was to show how governments organize different forms of forced labor to support slave capitalism. So we talked about military labor a lot. That's a big subject. But another point is, who's going to build the massive fortifications, right? Who's going to build the docks? Who's going to build the wharves? Who's going to build the warehouses? Who's going to build all of the things necessary that make an economy function efficiently? And when we did our book, we invited historians of the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, and the British Empire to study how their respective empires got that labor together to do the work that made slavery profitable. So we did like a transnational comparison of different unfree labor regimes organized by imperial governments. And those comparisons were pretty fascinating, and I think the big takeaway was every empire, to an extent that we hadn't recognized, devoted much of its resources to commanding and compelling people to work against their will to make slavery capitalism profitable, and through that work and through those profits to make those empires politically powerful.
Yes, sí, repito un poco lo que había dicho antes. Entonces, al final tenemos que subrayar quién al final ha construido todo lo que se ha hecho en esos países nuevos, ¿no? Al final fueron, sí, llamámoslos militares, llamámoslos esclavos, pero fueron ellos que formalmente, que prácticamente realizaron todo lo que de nuevo se empezó a construir en esos países desde las fortalezas hasta los puentes, a las calles y todas esas infraestructuras, como había dicho antes, leyendo las notas, ¿no? Y también el profesor dice que un aspecto que lo ha interesado mucho es es comparar las diferentes, lo que hicieron los diferentes dominios imperiales en otras partes del mundo, o en el Caribe también, y cómo actuar contra la ley al final se ha convertido en algo que ha sido como una forma de capitalismo, ¿no? Y de desarrollo de los intereses, por supuesto, del país dominante, ¿no?
So I'll finish with two major points. One of the things that Evelyn and I had a clear idea of is that we need new analytical categories to talk about the different kinds of labor that made the joined histories of empire and capital possible. I didn't come up with the analytical categories, Evelyn did, and I think they're brilliant. And here they are. And again, we go back to Marx for the first one, productive labor. Right? Productive labor is what economic historians have focused on the most. And productive labor is simply labor that produces for subsistence, just getting by, or produces commodities for exchange on markets, local, national, or global. That history has been so well canvassed and will be for the future because it's so critical. But yet, productive labor itself, as we've seen today, doesn't tell the whole labor history of global capitalism in the early modern period. We need a new analytical category for that. And this analytical category, Evelyn termed, and it's what I use also, she termed it constructive labor. That's why we called our book Building the Atlantic Empires. So what is constructive labor? I'll just read for you. A range of tasks even broader than those required in the private sector. Extracting state-owned resources. Building and sustaining settlements. Constructing imperial infrastructure. Ships, roads, forts, prisons, warehouses, governor's mansions. Transporting trade goods and defending these settlements on land and sea. This kind of labor might better be called the reproductive labor of empire. How do empires reproduce themselves generation after generation? You can't just look at the plantation. You can't just look at labor on merchant ships. You have to look at the labor that's making the imperial infrastructure a profitable host for commerce and plantation production. Okay, so when we talk about constructive labor, we're talking about a form of labor where the resources of the state were necessary in terms of their power to command that labor, because it would never have come voluntarily. So the reproduction of empire by constructive labor by nature was compulsory or forcible, coercive. Again, this gets right to the heart of another myth of capitalism that masquerades as economic theory today. That capitalist labor is essentially free labor, voluntary labor. And it's the incentive to work that makes capitalism work. Well, as historians, we have to reject that because the evidence suggests everything to the contrary. So with that, I'll conclude.
Yes, I think that is yeah.
¿Tienen any question?
I think it was fascinating the work that you and your Miss Evelyn did. It's kind of related to a reading that we had, or that I and some classmates had in our previous course, in the previous cycle, which was called Social and Political Process in Latin America. And it was a text written by Coatsworth, Coatsworth. My question is, in order for you both to have written this piece of work, how long did it take you? And do you have any copy here?
I can send you all a free PDF of this book because it's too expensive. It's like 114 American dollars. I wouldn't pay that much for it, and I helped to write it, you know. So the background of the book, Evelyn and I were invited to a really important seminar at Harvard University run by one of the greatest Atlantic historians ever, named Bernard Bailey. Atlantic history as a field wouldn't have existed without Bailey. So Bailey ran this important seminar, and what we discovered was that we were the only labor historians there. And we were the only ones who said this word: capitalism. Capitalism. It was considered a political term rather than a category of economic analysis or an economic system that you could analyze. And while we benefited tremendously from this seminar, and I owe my job to Bernard Bailey, who recommended me for it, we knew it was time to really put labor history at the center of Atlantic history. And I knew that because my advisor, my dissertation supervisor, an historian named Marcus Redeker, was already doing that. But we wanted a book that would be a lot more conceptual and theoretical. And Redeker's work is highly British-centered. My work is too. So we wanted a book that would canvas all of the Atlantic empires. And so that's the background. The influences, like who are the influences behind the book? Like what work did we draw on? Redeker and Peter Linebaugh would be another one. If you're not familiar with the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, get familiar with it. Because the best global labor history being done now, and mine, is coming out of there. And the director of research, Marcel van der Linden, at this institute, is the one who invited us to write this book.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think that we have understood.
Okay.
Yes, but
Okay. Some other historians, Marcel van der Linden, Edward Baptist, Sven Beckert, Seth Rockman, Peter Way, Denver Brunsman. And I would say Peter Way and Denver Brunsman are really ahead of the curve on the military labor aspect of all this. So Evelyn and I see our book as part of a wider trend in a new history of capitalism that is labor history oriented and that features the state as a central agent of capitalist expansion.